cohort, I think really the most impactful paper I think we've ever had, at least the biggest clinical impact right away, was Hege Grindham's paper in 2016 that showed a big change. If you hold them out to 9 months, you drastically decrease the re-rupture rate. And our data actually, if you look at the graph, looks about the same out to 12 months, but we didn't have enough statistical power to do that. So I recommend, my recommendations now for my patients is up there, if at least 9 months, and if they're 18 and under, a year. And that allows, there's some really nice work from Constance Chu at Stanford. She's a scientist and an orthopedic surgeon. And she has done these serial MRIs looking at graft healing. And you can really just see you can see the graft mature over these time periods. And really, it's out to about 24 months, the graft is still maturing. There are some people who have these nice, beautiful grafts at 6 months, but that's not the norm. So that's the time part. But biology matters.
Yeah, I think it does. And so the critical times here, I think, are minimum 9 months, and particularly with your younger athletes, really trying to hold them for a bit longer, until at least a year.
Yeah. And then, then we get into your bailiwick of the ACL-RSI and the questionnaires that are talking about confidence and fear and self-efficacy in some cases. This gives you some time at that tail end of rehab to really help them recover as a whole person, and then be ready to participate in sports. But we talk about the fearfulness. Often that fearfulness is because their knee doesn't feel right and they're not adequately rehabbed. So you get a little bit more time with that. On the other side, we've had like the flip side of the fearful patient is this super confident patient who races through rehab, scores super high on all the questionnaires, including the return to sport, the ACL-RSI, and they go back to sport early. They get out on the field and re-tear, right? Because they meet every single milestone and go. Those are the people we really have to hold off. And we have to be very, very imaginative in what we do with them in that terminal, that end part of rehab, to just hold them back. So for me, this is young girl athletes, young women's soccer, young girls, actually, not even women. They're kids who are soccer athletes, who are these super confident, who have hamstring grafts, right? Because they fit, and so they race through, and they don't have the extensor mechanism issues that patellar tendon and quad tendon grafts have. So they tend to get their quad strength back faster, and they just want to return. I think that's something that we really need to hold them back. So 9 months. If they're young, I keep them at a year.
And again, 9 months doesn't mean you can't do any sport until 9 months.
It means I take something from baseball pitching, no live pitches, right? Not right. No game.
Yeah, so your restrictions are going to be until 9 months or 12 months, but you're going to be doing some restricted participation, whether it's working on your own, whether it's doing some restricted decision making with an opponent, and then gradually progressing to 9 months. If you're passing all of those criteria, that's when we start to then progress. And it's not like you flick the switch at 9 months and go, oh, now you can play 90 minutes in a soccer match.
That's correct. No, we don't.
So again, it's a progression.
And again,
I think that's a really important message.
Remember, as sports physios, our job, and the surgeon's job also, is to our clearance is really to say the patient is safe to return. So they might not be physically up to snuff in terms of maybe their cardiovascular conditioning or many things that have to work to be able to play with their teams. But the other thing about that, though, is once we determine this safety, they're released to the care of their team. And then you have the coach or the manager, whoever it is, might say, this is a really great player, and this player playing at 50% is better than anybody else I have in that position on this team. So I'm going to, he'll play earlier. Does that make sense? So once we have to make sure that we've done our job and said, okay, it's safe for you to go back. And after that, you've got to let it be a coaching decision and stay out of it. Because if you don't think they're safe, you shouldn't clear them, right? So that's
and
where
again, we're coming back to this shared decision-making, multidisciplinary team where ideally you would have a coach involved in that decision-making process.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I don't want the coach affecting timing for me of the safety part. So I would like the coach to stay out of the decision until that time when we've decided that it is safe for this person to go back. And I'm not going to get involved in his coaching either. So
yeah, goes both ways.
Yep.
We touched on psychological readiness just before.
Sure.
And again, I want to just come back to that because we had a couple of questions about psychological readiness and specifically measuring it. And you mentioned the ACL RSI.
Yep.
Is that the tool that you're using in the clinic, or how are you assessing psychological readiness? What's your best tips for assessing psychological readiness?
We use the TSK-11, Tampa Scale Kinesiophobia, and the ACL RSI. And they actually measure different constructs, right? So when I think about kinesiophobia, I think about that early in rehab. Those patients who are really afraid to move, they're the ones who end up with, they have stiff knees, their quads aren't working. They're very timid about their rehabilitation. The ACL RSI is really for more later in rehabilitation, and that's about how do you feel about returning to play, right? Returning to your sport. And some of that, I think, sort of at the tail end, if in fact they are well rehabbed, and by that I mean have met all those other criteria, strength, et cetera, then you might be able to use some like psychologically informed physical therapy to help them get to the finish line. Does that make sense? But I don't see the people are afraid to move are my early problem, and afraid to go back to sport is a late problem. Often those people who are afraid to return to sport, who score poorly on the ACL RSI, I know there's a short form now, we haven't switched over to that yet, but those folks are not adequately rehabbed. So you have to go back to the fundamentals and make sure they've got full range of motion, their strength is good, they're not swelling, they don't have any knee pain, blah, blah, blah. Once you're sure that you've got those fundamentals done, then it's time to start to talk to them about what is it that you're afraid of, and try and work through that with them, with the data, which honestly can be a little scary.
Yeah, and I think this is where particularly the ACL RSI, or ACL return to sport after injury scale that was developed by Professor Kate Webster in Melbourne in Australia, that I think there's some really nice questions in there in that they do open up that conversation with the athlete. It's
the risk about the risk appraisal questions there's some that are more about how they see what the risks are.
Exactly. And the other nice thing I think about the ACL RSI is it's been now translated into so many languages.
Absolutely.
So it's in English, it's in Swedish, it's in Norwegian, it's in German and Dutch and Turkish and French. So I think a lot of folks are going to be able to find a version of it that suit the population that they're working with, which is one of the challenges, I think, for our international community sometimes with questionnaires.
And a nice thing is, Kate has not made this available to people free of charge, which is another, something that I really, really appreciate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. That's great. We're getting close to our hour, so I'm conscious about wrapping up on what's been such a really great conversation. And I'm going to come back to, I think, a question about rehab and the environment. We're sitting here recording this where many folks are under on lockdown or asked not to leave their homes as much as possible. So what are some exercise programs or tips for exercises that folks can recommend for their patients in this challenging environment that we're